February 1940. The temperature has dropped to -40 degrees. Hundreds of Soviet soldiers lie frozen across the snow, weapons still in hand, eyes wide open. They didn't die in battle. They tried to run. But Finnish snipers never gave them the chance. The Soviet officer who found the scene wrote in his diary, "It's as if the forest is eating us alive." In 105 days, the Soviet Union lost 126,000 soldiers. Finland lost 25,000. On one side, a massive empire of 170 million people. On the other, a small northern country that had barely crossed 3.5 million. And the small one almost stopped the giant. This is the story of the Winter War. But it's not just a war story. It's a story of how a nation fought to exist, how an army won with intelligence beyond courage, and one of history's greatest military humiliations. But wait, maybe you're thinking, okay, a small country fought well against a big one. So what? That's exactly where the real story begins. The consequences of this war didn't only affect Finland or the Soviets. Adolf Hitler watched this war closely and saw how weak the Red Army appeared. That observation directly influenced his biggest and most fateful decision, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. In other words, the course of the Winter War also changed the course of World War II. A small country's 105-day resistance shaped world history. Now let's go back to the beginning and tell the whole story from scratch. Finland gained its independence from Russia in 1917. Amid the chaos of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Finns seized their opportunity. But independence didn't come easy. It was immediately followed by a bloody civil war that tore the country apart. Divided between the Reds and the Whites, Finland endured an internal conflict that claimed thousands of lives. The Whites won. The country stabilized. But the memory remained. In the interwar period, Finland worked to establish itself as a respected democratic republic in Europe. It built a small but organized military, developed its economy, and strengthened its education system. Yet there was always a shadow to the east, the enormous Soviet Union. The Soviet-Finnish border was only 30 kilometers from Leningrad, the Soviet's second largest city. That was artillery range. Stalin knew it well. By 1939, the world had become a dangerous place. Hitler had invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. Stalin saw an opportunity. While the West was consumed by its own conflicts, he could secure his borders. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939, shocked the world. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had secretly agreed. Under the pact's secret protocols, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of Romania were placed within the Soviet sphere of influence. Stalin's turn had come. October 1939, a Soviet delegation presented Finland with a proposal. The gist was this: Finland would cede a portion of Karelia, particularly territories close to Leningrad, to the Soviets. In return, the Soviets would give Finland some larger, but more remote land in the north. Sounds reasonable. It wasn't, because the territories Finland was being asked to surrender were of extraordinary strategic value. The Mannerheim Line ran through those very lands. Pulling back the border meant handing it over. In other words, Finland was being asked to give up its greatest defensive weapon. The Finns joined the negotiations. They sought a diplomatic solution. But on one point, they never gave ground sovereignty. The talks reached a deadlock. Stalin grew impatient. On November 26, 1939, a report circled the globe. Finnish artillery had supposedly fired on the Soviet village of Mainila, killing Soviet soldiers. It was later revealed that this was a staged provocation organized by Stalin, a classic false flag operation to manufacture a pretext for war. But at the time, it worked. The Soviets declared the attack a retaliation. On the morning of November 30, 1939, Soviet aircraft began bombing Helsinki. The Winter War had begun. Stalin's plan was simple, and had been tested many times. Overwhelming force, rapid advance, swift surrender. The Soviets mobilized for 150,000 soldiers, more than 6,000 tanks, and 3,800 aircraft. That was nearly 4 times the size of Finland's entire armed forces. Some Soviet generals estimated the war would be over in 2 weeks. One went further. He said for days. Finland's total population was 3.5 million. They could mobilize around 300,000 soldiers. Their tank force was extremely limited, their air force small, their modern weapons insufficient. On paper, this war was over before it started. But paper meant nothing in pine forest and frozen lakes. Finland's greatest weapon wasn't manpower, it was geography. The Karelian Isthmus was a nightmare for Soviet tanks. Dense forest, countless lakes, and swampy terrain made large-scale armored operations nearly impossible. Tanks were forced to move along roads, and the roads were controlled by the Finns or easily controlled. Dark military planning room inside the Soviet Union. Officers gathered around a massive map of Finland covered with strategic markings. Stacks of intelligence reports filling the table as the atmosphere shifts from diplomacy toward military planning, ultra-realistic, historically accurate, cinematic documentary photography, National Geographic style, photorealistic, HDR 8K 16:9, dramatic composition, no text, no watermark. The Western press would call it the Maginot Line of the North, but it was far more effective than the Maginot Line because it had men willing to defend it, and those men knew exactly what they were doing. Finnish tactics left Soviet commanders baffled. Small Finnish units, sometimes just a few dozen men, began encircling Soviet columns in the forest. The Finnish name for this tactic was Motti, a unit of measurement for cutting wood. The meaning, cut large Soviet columns apart, isolate them from the road, then destroy them piece by piece. A Soviet convoy advanced through the forest. The Finns cut the front by felling a tree, blowing a bridge. Then they cut the rear. The column split into 2, 3 for sections. Each piece was now on its own in freezing cold, without supplies, no help coming. The Finns moved fast, because every one of them could ski. The Soviet soldier looked heroic on propaganda postcards. Out there, he was helpless. One of this war's most iconic figures was a man who never sought fame. Simo Häyhä, born in 1905, a small, plain-faced Finnish farmer with an unremarkable expression. But when he picked up a rifle, he became something else entirely. Over 100 days of the Winter War, he killed more than 500 Soviet soldiers. This figure stands as the highest confirmed kill count by a single sniper in a single conflict. The Soviets called him the White Death. He didn't use a telescopic sight. A scope meant raising your head. Instead, he challenged his targets with an iron-sighted rifle, the Molson Nagin M28. He didn't wear snow camouflage. While lying in the snow, he held snow in his mouth, so his breath wouldn't create visible vapor and give him away. Sometimes he lay motionless in the same position for hours. The Soviets tried artillery and sent counter-snipers. Nothing worked. Near the war's final days, a Soviet soldier finally wounded him. An exploding round shattered the left side of his face. He survived, but the war was already ending, so he never held a rifle again. He died quietly in 2002 at the age of 96. He spent the rest of his life farming and breeding hunting dogs. Asked about his achievements, he simply replied, "I did my job." One of the war's most stunning episodes unfolded at Suomussalmi. December 1939, the Soviet 44th and 163rd Divisions aimed to capture the small town of Suomussalmi and push west toward the Gulf of Bothnia. Had they succeeded, Finland would have been cut in two. The 163rd Division took the town. But then it was trapped. The Finns cut the roads. The 44th Division was sent to help. It too was ambushed along the way. The Finns under General Hjalmar Siilasvuo, with roughly 11,000 men, applied the Motti tactic against a Soviet force of 50,000. They sliced the Soviet column into segments. They squeezed each segment separately. The divisions could receive no supplies, no reinforcements, and couldn't retreat. Soviet soldiers froze. Vehicles, artillery, and tanks were abandoned in the forest. The survivors scattered into the trees. Most of them died there too, of cold. When the accounting was done at the end of January 1940, the picture was staggering. The Soviet 44th Division had been almost entirely destroyed. 17,500 soldiers had died. The captured equipment list was staggering: 50 artillery pieces, 71 tanks, over 160 vehicles. Finnish losses, approximately 750 dead. Stalin was furious, but he wasn't stupid. The Red Army's performance in the first months had been catastrophic. The chain of command wasn't functioning. Officers were afraid to show initiative, because during Stalin's great purges of 1937-38, officers who acted independently had been shot. Commanders waited for orders. Orders came late. In the time between, the Finns attacked. Stalin then placed Semyon Timoshenko in command of the armies. Timoshenko's mission: fix the system, and he really did. Throughout January and February 1940, the Soviets reorganized. Smaller, more flexible units were formed. Coordination between infantry and armored forces improved. Supply chains were reinforced. Most critically, massive artillery concentrations were built up to directly breach the Mannerheim Line. Finland, meanwhile, was wearing down from the start of the war. The Finns had shown extraordinary resistance. But keeping an army of 300,000 in the field for months was not sustainable for a small country. Supply lines were strained. The expected aid from the West came either too late or not at all, while Sweden and Norway refused land access. Finland was alone. February 1st, 1940. The Soviets launched their assault, but this time it was different. First, 10 days of uninterrupted artillery bombardment. The Mannerheim Line's bunkers were obliterated one by one. Then a massive infantry and tank offensive. The Finns tried to hold their positions, but this time the Soviets advanced in a coordinated, disciplined, and overwhelming force. On February 11th, Suma, one of the line's key strongpoints, fell. The clock was now ticking for Finland. Soviet forces began pouring through. Finnish units were forced to withdraw. Defense lines eroded day by day. There was no fallback position behind the Mannerheim Line. Finland's only option was to return to the negotiating table. March 12, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. Finland accepted severe territorial losses. The greater part of Karelia, representing 10% of Finnish territory and home to 422,000 people, was ceded to the Soviets. The Hanko Peninsula was leased to the Soviets as a naval base for 40 years. The Soviets had won, but at what cost? Official Soviet figures were kept secret for many years. The archives opened during the Glasnost era revealed the truth. The Soviets had lost between 126,000 and 168,000 soldiers. The wounded exceeded 200,000. The ratio was roughly 5-1. Yes, the Soviets gained territory, but the price they paid as a state was a humiliating bill. In the eyes of the world, the image of the Red Army had been shattered. And now we come to the most critical part of this story. The Winter War wasn't only fought between Finland and the Soviets. The whole world watched, and among the most attentive observers was Adolf Hitler. Hitler and the German High Command followed the war with great interest. Little Finland's ability to resist for months, and the Soviets' struggle to break through, led Germany to one conclusion: the Red Army had rotted. This assessment wasn't entirely wrong. During Stalin's purges, 35,000 officers had been executed or imprisoned. Most were experienced commanders. Those who remained feared taking initiative and waited for orders. Hitler became convinced that invading the Soviet Union would be far easier than expected. That belief directly led to Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. Hitler was wrong. The Red Army had learned from the Winter War, and Timoshenko's reforms continued. But Hitler failed to recognize it. Finland's resistance pushed him toward one of history's greatest military miscalculations, ultimately helping accelerate the downfall of Nazi Germany. A small country's 105-day resistance changed the course of history. If you want to understand Finland, there's one word you need to know: sisu. Sisu doesn't translate perfectly into English, but roughly it means determination pushed beyond the limits of reason, the capacity to resist when on the verge of collapse, to keep doing what is hard, even when it looks impossible. This is what held Finnish soldiers and civilians together throughout the Winter War. Women across the country carried food, clothing, and medical supplies to the front. Even children volunteered for the war effort. Everyone did something. No one said, "This doesn't concern me." Finland stood on the line between existence and oblivion, and it fought to the last to keep from crossing it. Today, in Finland, every family has a direct or indirect connection to the war. Grandfathers told the story. Mothers told the story. The memory was kept alive. After the Winter War, Finland was forced to confront another choice. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941, Finland moved too. In the period known as the Continuation War, Finland worked alongside the Germans without a formal alliance, but in practical coordination to reclaim its lost territories. This period remains one of the most debated and sensitive chapters of Finnish history. Forced into a tacit cooperation with Germany, Finland still faced a heavy peace treaty at war's end, though its territorial losses were not as great as in the Winter War. Throughout the Cold War, Finland learned to coexist peacefully with the Soviets through a policy later known as Finlandization. But when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Finland abandoned its 80-year policy of neutrality and joined NATO. The Winter War teaches us several things. Numbers aren't everything. Geography, tactics, motivation, and leadership can overcome them. The difference between a society fighting on its own soil and an empire fighting in foreign forest is far greater than any statistic can capture. And perhaps most importantly, size is no guarantee of supremacy. The powerful crushing the weak is not inevitable. History has proven this over and over again, Finland proved it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden stories behind history's greatest conflicts, don't forget to subscribe to Secrets of War. Every week, we explore remarkable battles, forgotten strategies, extraordinary acts of courage, and the untold stories that shaped our world. Until the next documentary, history still has many secrets waiting to be discovered.